Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Michelle Martinez.
Hi, I'm Dave Waldner. Nice to meet you. Yeah. All right, Travis has asked if you can get in now.
Yes.
The second in person.
So I'm unmuted. Yeah. Do you want me to hang up and talk through the computer now? Yeah, I am unmuted right now. Okay, I've unmuted again. Okay, all right. Okay. Nah, that's all good. Nobody needs to see me. Yeah, okay. All right, will do. Thank you. Thanks.
So where's the camera that's shooting out? Oh, okay.
Yep, it does follow you around. Okay, so you're good to go. So right now you're seeing what they see video wise. Right now on everybody's screen, the share's focused. So your slides are always good to be.
We just go ahead.
Everything is turned on. Right here. So you're hot, everybody can hear you and see you. And whenever you're ready to go, you're good.
All right.
Good?
Great.
All right.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So that's
Sir, how's it going? Goes well. I hear you're close to a rod.
everybody, we're in traffic. Apparently. I guess I don't know if that's good or bad. I guess that's good news to have travel, as opposed to the news that often travels.
Word on the street.
The stuff that sticks to
It's all good.
smell better. But yeah, maybe next week.
Oh, really?
I mean, it'll either publish next week or the week after. We're waiting on one signature still. So the lawyers have all signed up. That's the, I take that as good news.
That's makes sense.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Martinez. I'm with Bentley Systems and your moderator for the session. So welcome. Our session is consulting party meeting, and I want to introduce Patty Dunaway, who is joining virtually. Welcome, Patty, and thank you for serving this morning. Patty has a career in transportation and includes 27 years with KYTC, serving in various roles, including Chief District Engineer and State Highway Engineer. In the last 3.5 years with Michael Baker International, she's overseeing Louisville, Indianapolis, Charleston, and the West Virginia offices. Also here live with us this morning is David Waldner. David is the Director of Environmental Services for Palmer Engineering. He works with their Winchester, Kentucky office. His work there is primarily focused on the environmental review of developing transportation projects to satisfy NEPA requirements. He is a retired employee of KYTC, and he served at KYTC for nearly 17 years as the Director of the Division of Environmental Analysis. He's a graduate of UK, where he received a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering in 1983. He's also a licensed PE. Combined, yes, 38 years of experience. And I will give a reminder at the end of our session to please provide your feedback on the session via that. So.
Good morning. Thank you for that introduction. Times are certainly different, so we have to adjust and adapt. We were on the fly here a few minutes ago. I thought that we were trying to get Patty all connected up. I hear it said that when you're flying an airplane, it's 2 minutes of terror followed by hours of boredom and then another 2 minutes of terror. Well, we had our 2 minutes of terror. And I was already planning to supply the boredom. So we'll go from there. So we're going to talk about consulting party meetings, but before we get started with that, how many of you in the room have ever worked on a design build job? Okay, a few of you. So the contractors, often when you meet with them, you have a meeting with the contractor. A lot of times they start out the meeting with, they'll have a 1 minute or a 2 minute talk about safety. That's, first and foremost of them. So before we get started this morning, I'll take a little different approach to that. I'd like to share with you an environmental tip of the day. Now, I don't know whether any of you will find that particularly useful, but if you do, please don't contact me. I prefer not to be an accessory either before or after the fact. Okay, so I said we're going to talk about consulting parties and how to navigate the consulting party process. One thing that we were told was at a recent project manager boot camp, there were a lot of questions about consulting parties, who they were, how to engage them, how to have meetings, how many meetings you had to have, those types of things. So we're going to talk through kind of all those issues as we move through our presentation this morning. Now, the process can be a little bit confusing if it's not something that you do every day, like Amanda, for example. But we're going to try to boil it down to things that will make it easy for you to take away, hopefully. So we're going to talk about who the consulting parties are and what's their role in the process. How do you identify consulting parties to engage in the process? When should you do that? How do you do that? We're going to talk about meetings, which are sometimes required, not on every project, but if you have to have consulting party meetings, how do you schedule those? What should the content of those be? How are they organized? We're going to talk about the importance of when you have those meetings following up with the consulting parties so that they feel the importance that you feel for them being involved in the process. And then finally, we're going to talk about some lessons learned collectively, both for doing in-person and virtual meetings, which of course we've had to do some over the course of the last year. So some lessons learned that'll maybe help you to be able to effectively manage the process for your own projects. So I almost laughed when I saw the title on this slide. What is Section 106? Well, I'm sure not going to try to tell you that, other than from the highest of levels, that is part of the National Historic Preservation Act. And it requires federal agencies to consider impacts to historic properties when they're making decisions regarding either where the funding's being used, permitting actions on their part, or federal lands may be deemed affected. So the consulting party aspect of that comes in through this Section 106. And this is taken from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the ACHP website. And it gives a little flow chart of what's in the Section 106 process. The first part, initiating the process, includes this third bullet that says identify the State Historic Preservation Officer, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, SHPO and TIPO, Indian tribes or Native Hawaiian organizations. You don't have to worry about Hawaiian organizations here, and other parties. And some of our focus today is going to be on who these other parties are and how we're going to engage them. Let's take a look at the rest of that chart. I know that's a little small for you in the room, perhaps, but I think you can see the headings on each of the sections. Initiate the process. Then we're going to identify historic properties that are within the area that's going to be potentially affected by the project. Determine whether or not any of those properties are going to be affected, possibly adversely by the project. And then if there are adverse effects, resolve those. Determine what mitigation is going to be provided by the project to try to mitigate for that adverse effect. So this question, or this third bullet that I pointed out from the previous slide, and other parties, I've circled that shows up in every one of these steps. So the point is, these people who are consulting parties are supposed to be involved throughout the entire process. It's not just something you go to them early and don't have to return to. It's an ongoing consultation that has to occur. I'll also point out, and again, apologize if it's difficult to read, but the last bullet in each of these steps also makes reference to the requirement that the public also be involved in this process. So we'll talk a little bit more about the public part of it shortly, but for now, let's focus on these other parties that are referenced there. So who are these other parties? From the previous slide, they identified some, the SHPO and Indian tribes that would be involved. Beyond that, it's people who would have what the regulations say have a demonstrated interest in the undertaking, the project. So these might typically be property owners that are in the corridor where alternatives are being considered, historic preservation organizations, historic societies, historic museums that might be in the local area. Neighborhood associations would also be included in that. One that I didn't put a bullet up there, but are very important, are local officials. The city and local government need to be contacted. They may have historic preservation branches within their organization that would want to participate. So identifying these people early on is important. My recommendation is that this be done at the early step when you're trying to determine what the area of potential effect is. As that coordination and consultation is going on with the SHPO's office, the list of potential consulting parties also be part of that early coordination and get those people identified at that early stage. So we've talked about who the consulting parties are and when to involve them. Well, what are they being involved? What are they being asked to do? What are their responsibilities? Well, it's to provide input at each of those 4 steps that were shown in the flow chart: eligibility, effects, and mitigation for adverse effects. They're providing input, sharing views, offering ideas that can be incorporated, considered by the project team that's advancing the project. It's important, I think, to always make it clear, perhaps at every meeting, and we'll talk about when we talk about consulting party roles later, that it's always be made clear to them that the consulting parties, that the project team is interested in what they have to say. They're going to consider what they have to say, but the consulting parties are not decision makers in the process. The decision maker is the cabinet, federal highways, and to some degree, the SHPO certainly has a great deal of influence at times over some decisions, but the consulting parties themselves are not really decision makers in the process. So how do we get consulting parties involved? Well, I mentioned identifying who these parties are early on. Once those are identified, then invitation letters should be sent out to those parties, inviting them to participate, directing them toward the cabinet's website, where you can go online and fill out information and be approved as a consulting party for the project. I mentioned earlier that the public needs to have an opportunity to be involved. So from the public involvement, your PIOs in the district office, if press releases are being sent out as the project's getting started, saying, hey, this project's getting started, expect some activities to be occurring out here. Good idea to incorporate into that a message about the ability to join as a consulting party. Certainly any public notices that are put in the papers for public meetings that are going to come up should include language that talks about that opportunity. And then at the meetings themselves, there should always be an opportunity there for people to be made aware of what a consulting party is, what their role in the process is, how they can join the process. With the cabinet's process or system that they have online today, we found it effective to, if you have Wi-Fi capability at the meeting, just take a laptop computer with you. If someone's interested in that, they can get online right there, fill out their application. If they need some assistance, that can be provided at that time. But we found that to be an effective way of doing that. So when we talk about having these consulting party meetings, one of the questions that comes up is, well, how many do we need to have? And when do we need to have them? Well, as with many things in the environmental area, the answer is it depends. It depends upon the context of the project that you're talking about. A bridge replacement project with a bridge that's non-distinct, that's probably not going to require consulting party meetings. But if you change the context, make that a historic bridge that's in the middle of an urban area, then there's going to be a lot of interest in how that bridge is going to be either replaced or rehabilitated. So it depends upon the context as to how many meetings or whether you have to have meetings at all. So as projects increase in complexity and the potential for impacts to historic properties increase, then that's going to increase the amount of consultation likely to be required for throughout the process. So for a major widening, new construction on new alignment type of project, that sounds like a project in all likelihood probably going to have a consulting party meeting, or at least opportunity for people to join in that way. Bigger projects, Louisville Bridges type projects, I know there aren't many of those, but as I'm just saying, projects on that end of the scale, more likely that you're going to have to hold at least one consulting party meeting to address eligibility effects and start the conversation about mitigation, bigger projects like that. Those that may be separated into 3 separate meetings. So it's important early on to determine what level of involvement is going to be necessary so that can be integrated with the schedule for the project. If your project is, if you anticipate that you're probably going to be dealing with adverse effects and are going to have this discussion of mitigation with consulting parties, well, you're not going to be able to schedule that until a place in the project development process where your preferred alternative, it has become known. So around PLNG time. So you have to take those things into account in trying to figure out the best place and time to insert these into the overall project schedule. So I'm going to now kick it over to Patty to talk a little bit about how to organize a consulting party meeting. Hopefully she can join us right now.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Okay, great. So once the consulting party members have been identified, then it's time to reach out to them and start to organize your meeting. So we recommend first that you identify that point of contact for the project team. That could be the client PM, the consultant PM, environmental manager, various different people. But it's most important to make sure that you get reliable contact information. And at that point of contact is going to be available and respond when the consulting party members reach out to them. Also, we found that sometimes some of your consulting party members may need help with transportation for getting to in-person meetings, or if they do not have internet access for virtual meetings, you might have to make some accommodations for them. So make sure that you have, excuse me, that opportunity. Then we need to set the meeting date and make sure that that date and time is most convenient for those consulting party members. And if it's going to be a ways out, we suggest that you send out a hold the date to get that on their calendars, or send them a letter letting them know that that's upcoming. The draft letter, we say, should come from the KYTC project manager, basically because they're the owners of the project, so that they can personally invite and explain the importance of the input of that consulting party member. Suggest that you send it out a couple of weeks ahead of time. And then also provide hard copies of those documents that you're going to be reviewing. You can send like an agenda, the presentation, both by mail, getting their home addresses or their business addresses, as well as sending them electronically. Some additional suggestions that we have on the next slide there for meeting organization, including asking them to send questions ahead of time. That helps you and us as we prepare for those meetings. And then you work to put together an agenda. Then as it's coming closer to the time, you can send out an electronic reminder. But the most important thing that we found is to make sure that you practice. You want to be comfortable with the information. You want to plan ahead, anticipate what questions may be asked of you, and so that you'll be comfortable whenever that time comes for the meeting. We've also found in talking about the virtual meetings, the platform needs to be familiar with the group, just like today using Zoom is very familiar. It's typically free for people to use. We all know Teams has gotten very popular, but whatever the platform, we found that it's very helpful to send out instructions. Those instructions would include things like downloading the app, how to enter the meeting, how to use the chat, raise your hand feature, those type of things. So when you're setting that meeting up, I think this is good preparation, and it helps everybody to be comfortable and ready to join. Then you can move ahead with the agenda content. So there are several components or items that you would want to include into the consulting party meetings. This list here, the introductions, ground rules, all of those are important to have, providing that project purpose and need and an overview of the project, as well as why we're here, with the Section 106 process, redefining, what consulting parties are, what their role is, telling them ahead of time of any terms, definitions that may be used in the presentation, and kind of setting the stage for what they're going to hear. Now we're going to take a closer look at a few of those agenda items, starting with the ground rules. Me personally, I found that this is very helpful, both in person and virtually, because we all have been in meetings where you've had distractions or other issues, things come up during the meetings. These ground rules just establish the expectations for everybody in attendance, and they serve as a good reminder that, hey, it's important that you're here, but we want you to focus on this meeting and the information that we're providing to you so that we can get your input. So, things like making sure that they have their phones on silent, making sure that they understand everybody's going to have an opportunity to speak. And, we want them to listen to each other and the ideas that they have, because all those ideas are valuable. So, making sure also that they have an understanding of the project is important. So when we look at the project information, some of them are going to come into there, like Dave mentioned, with the local officials. They probably have a good idea of what the purpose and need is behind the project, but not, any business owner, property owner, agency representative. Those that are other members of the consulting party team may not have as good understanding. So explaining where you are with the project, again, talking about the description of the Section 106 process, explaining their role. All of these are important to make sure that everybody is on the same page. And again, re-emphasizing that their input is very important in this process. So now I want to toss it back to Dave as he talks about kind of the meat of the meeting.
Yeah, so after getting through those preliminary things, just making sure everyone has an understanding about the project and the purpose of the meeting, then it's time to get to the purpose of actually why that meeting has been called. And that is to present information to the consulting parties on eligibility, effects, and possibly mitigation issues, and to seek their input. One thing that is always important to remember to do when you're having a discussion about eligibility or eligibility and effects, after the consultant has run through all the properties that are being considered, it's always important to ask the consulting parties, are there any other properties that we should be considering? There may be history behind a particular property that hasn't necessarily, if not evident, from looking at the property. And so it's always important. They may know something about the local history that we coming in, maybe as outsiders, have overlooked at that point. So it's always important to ask for their opinion about that. The information, as you go through talking about eligibility, effects, and mitigation, that all needs to be presented in an organized and logical fashion that people who are not involved in this process routinely will be able to understand. So it's important not to get too caught up with using jargon that we typically use a lot. So we throw around a lot of terms, the ACHP and the SHPO and the Heritage Council. We just need to make sure that they understand all the terminology that we're using. So in making the presentation, the use of photographs is really helpful. I think most people probably do that. A point maybe that doesn't need to be made, but showing the people properties that you've identified that are of importance is a good way to communicate that information to them. Within the slides, it's also important to explain to them why that particular property is important. So, for example, on this slide, this observation gauge, it says it's eligible under criteria A for association with river transportation and a flood warning system. So make sure that they understand why each of these properties are considered to be important. And then when talking about the assessing of effects, It's important to make sure to discuss how these properties that have been identified, how each of the alternatives may or may not have an effect on that particular property. That discussion of effects need to be both the direct effects. Are we taking from within the boundary? Is that going to be necessary? Or are there possibly indirect effects that might come from vibration, noise, or even a visual aspect? In terms of once you've kind of gotten through that meat of the meeting, whatever that was, then it's important that they understand what the next steps are going to be. And so typically with any of these meetings, there's going to be a comment period where the consulting parties are afforded some time, a week, 10 days, 2 weeks after the meeting to submit additional comments that can be considered during the consultation. Those comments will be assimilated, reviewed by KYTC, by the Heritage Council, and the two of them will discuss those and then hopefully come to some agreement. There may be a suggestion that some additional research might be necessary. They may agree that that's appropriate, or that an additional property needs to be investigated. We had a project in Nelson County where we had an alignment, and someone who had joined as a consulting party said, well, I feel like from what you're describing, my farm sounds like maybe it's an eligible property. We had not identified that as such. It had been looked at, but our determination had been that it was not eligible. We met with that person out on site in the week following, and it did, in fact, was determined to be an eligible property, which required an alternative that split that parcel. And so we had to redesign that alignment. So those kind of things can come from the comments that are received during these consulting party meetings. But at some point then, everything's going to hash itself out, and the SHPO will take an action, either make determinations of eligibility, effect, or both. And if adverse effects are involved, then an MOA would be drafted. Important that the consulting parties be involved in that part of the process as well. When you're having your effects meeting, mitigation is a good topic to bring up toward the end of that. We believe that we're going to have this adverse effects. What type of mitigation do you think would be appropriate for us to consider? So those ideas can be considered by the decision makers as that process moves forward. Once that mitigation strategy has been determined, then that MOA is finalized and would be circulated for signatures. The consulting parties, in some cases, it's up to the department or to Federal Highways, but consulting parties may be invited to actually be a signatory on the agreement itself. If they are offered that opportunity but decline, that doesn't change anything. The agreement would move forward as long as the agencies are signing. But it does give them an opportunity, if that's afforded, that they can take some ownership in the decisions that were made and the mitigation that was determined to be appropriate for the project. So I'm going to kick it back to Patty for let her talk a little bit about the importance of following up with consulting parties after the meeting.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So as the meeting is concluding, and very soon afterwards, you want to follow up with the group. Now, you've told them all along during your meeting and in your previous correspondence how important their input is. So this is one way that you can truly show them how that is true. So by either email or a letter, you can follow up with them to thank them again for attending. You can send a copy of the meeting summary or the recording that was provided during the meeting. That summary and the comments that were received are very helpful for them. That shows that we were listening to them. We can also provide a direction to whom they want to send any additional comments and suggestions. We need to give them a date for when those comments need to be submitted so that we know when to move forward with the next step. And also to instruct them how they can get that additional information that Dave was talking about. So whether it is a link or, coming into the district office, various different ways to do that. So that way they know what those next steps are, and they know that it's continued. Their continued input is very important to the whole group so that we can continue to move the process forward and get their input recorded with the project. So now Dave and I want to share some lessons learned. We kind of did a brainstorm here. So again, the first thing we can always say is for these meetings, be prepared, make sure that you set a schedule and practice, establish time slots for each of the sections. We also have found that if you break it up so that you have the various points that they can ask questions. Again, those meeting ground rules, both for in-person and virtual, are key. I just think that this sets the tone for the meeting, shows that you're serious and you want to hear from them. Consistently steering them back to the section 106 so that they do not kind of tend to go to other project concerns such as right-of-way, other alternatives. Sometimes it could be tolling. There's a lot of different issues that sometimes come up. So we want to make sure that we consistently focus on why we're here at the meeting. Have a plan for other attendees. In my experience, we have had people that weren't necessarily invited to the consulting party meeting, but they show up. They've heard about it. Recently, I'll tell you here, recently we had one where we had somebody from Missouri to show up on a project that didn't really have, input into it, at least in the consulting party meeting. But I made sure that we pulled them aside. We explained why we were there. We told them they would have an opportunity to speak at the end. So it all went peacefully. They, appreciated hearing us, listening to them, hearing what they had to say. Again, providing those breaks for people to know that we will take breaks to hear any questions so that they can be heard. And this is both in person and virtually. And having your speakers, whoever is presenting, your team members, each stress the importance of their input. That just this kind of drives it home that there's reason they're there and that we want to hear from them. Additionally, we have some sending up reminders and those follow-ups demonstrate that you are interested, providing various different ways to communicate with them, as we've shown in the presentation, by email, phone, regular mail, all shows that we're making the effort to do that. Keeping control of the meeting, just to make sure that, I think a lot of us have been in in-person meetings where you have one person kind of grandstanding. So it's important to keep control, call on people that aren't participating, because we do want to get participation from all of them. Just as my example, sometimes we designate someone at in-person meetings to talk one-on-one with that most vocal attendee that's there. And that really, provides an opportunity for them to voice their opinion. Sometimes we even document it just to make sure that they know that they're heard. And virtually, if you let people know that, hey, if we're having things that are distracting, like background noise, or if they continue, if they butt in, do things like that, you've established that in the ground rules. So removing that attendee, we've told them ahead of time. So you're not trying to offend anybody, but sometimes you have to do things like that. So Dave, I think that concludes our presentation. So turn it back to see if there's any questions or comments there in person or through the chat feature.
Question? Yes. Oh, 5 minutes. Thank you. One thing I will just say in terms of these lessons learned, I mentioned earlier, we've had some experience in the last year with doing these consulting party meetings virtually. Our experience has generally been pretty good, get good participation. It is much easier to control the meeting in that environment. Sometimes the consulting parties don't particularly like that. We've heard that expressed. But in terms of being able to present the information and be responsive to them as well, it does seem to be a good way to manage time. So I've heard a lot of discussion about that may become a more maybe even a preferred way of having these meetings even after the COVID-19 issues maybe subside. Questions in the room, I don't think. They're here, I don't see them on chat.
No, I don't think we have any.
Okay. All right, well, we thank you for being here this morning and enjoy the rest of the conference and your next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
One more thing, please submit your feedback to the app.
No point in time, during this meeting, ever said you would do that.
Thanks for getting us set up there. Worked well.
It did.
Yeah, like that's something like we have to,
It's getting better.
you know, we start having the ability to post it. We develop software, but not like post the audio directly to the website. No, I just, you know, I think we did that.